Miller's Planet. 1 hour on this single ocean world cost the crew 7 years back home, and Interstellar makes you feel every lost decade. Christopher Nolan released the film in 2014, and its most famous scene drops Cooper and Brand onto a planet orbiting a supermassive black hole called Gargantua. Because the planet sits so deep in that gravity well, it experiences extreme gravitational time dilation, and the ratio is brutal. 1 hour on the surface equals 7 years for anyone watching from far away, a dilation factor of roughly 60,000. The crew spends about 3 hours and 17 minutes wading through the shallows, and when they climb back to orbit, Romilly, who stayed aboard the Endurance, has aged 23 years, 4 months, and 8 days. Dr. Laura Miller had landed years before them, but thanks to the same effect, she died only minutes before they arrived. Her wreckage is still fresh. This is gravitational dilation, not the velocity kind, and Einstein's general relativity is the engine. Time runs slower in stronger gravitational fields. The detail that sells it is that Caltech physicist Kip Thorne served as science advisor and co-wrote the equations behind Gargantua, even working out why those mountainous waves exist. The planet is tidally locked and rocking against the black hole's tidal forces. The surface gravity sits at about 130% of Earth's, which is why every step looks like such a fight. This is the depiction that pushed time dilation into mainstream conversation, and it is the rare blockbuster that got the physics broadly right with a working physicist behind the math. It lands because the dilation is not abstract. It is a father losing his daughter's entire life over what feels to him like an afternoon. Statue of Liberty. Taylor thinks he crash-landed on an alien world 2,000 light-years from home, and relativity is the reason he is dead wrong. Planet of the Apes, released in 1968 and directed by Franklin Schaffner, sends Taylor and his crew out on a near-light-speed deep space mission launched in 1972. The screenplay leans on what it calls Dr. Haslein's theory of time, which is plainly Einstein's special relativity, wearing a different name. The ship even carries dual chronometers, one reading space-time and one reading Earth-time, so the widening gap is right there on the dashboard. The crew ages roughly a year and a half during transit, while centuries roll by on Earth, and they finally touch down in the year 3978. That is velocity time dilation at work. Traveling close to light speed slows the travelers' clocks relative to everyone they left behind. Then comes the twist you already know. The 8th planet is Earth itself, wrecked by nuclear war during the millennia the crew skipped over, and the elapsed figure plays as roughly 2,000 years on screen. This is the foundational mainstream depiction of velocity dilation, decades ahead of Interstellar, and it weaponizes the concept for one of cinema's most famous reveals. The dilation is not a side effect here, it is the entire engine of the ending. Hyperspeed Loops. Buzz takes a 4-minute test flight, lands, and finds that everyone he knows has aged 4 years while he stepped out for coffee. Pixar's Lightyear, released in 2022 and directed by Angus MacLane, builds its whole emotional spine on this. Buzz keeps attempting test flights to reach hyperspeed, and each loop runs about 4 minutes for him. But for every 4 minutes he spends near light speed, roughly 4 years pass for the colony on the planet below. Flight after flight, he comes back to find his friend Alicia older, then married, then raising a family, then gone, dead of old age, while he has barely aged at all. The mechanism on display is velocity time dilation, from approaching light speed, and the team did consult NASA astronaut Thomas Marshburn on the science. They also admitted taking liberties. Real test launches measured in seconds or minutes would displace Buzz by hours, not decades. But the exaggeration is a choice, not an accident. Lightyear is the most accessible on-ramp to the whole idea, aimed at a family audience, and it still manages to gut you through Alicia aging across what feel like ordinary launches. It proves you do not need a black hole to break someone's heart with relativity. 8 lost years. David is gone for what feels like an afternoon, and he comes home to a family that has aged 8 years without him. Flight of the Navigator, the Disney film from 1986, follows 12-year-old David Freeman, who is taken aboard an alien craft moving at relativistic speeds. 8 years pass on Earth, while only about 4.4 hours pass for him. He returns completely unchanged, matching his own missing child poster, and his once younger brother is now older than he is. The film even names the trip, a round trip of roughly 1,100 light-years, somehow completed in those few hours. The math does not actually hold together. A journey that long should age Earth far more than 8 years, and it is a known goof rather than a feature. But the family reunion gut punch still works, precisely because the dilation here is modest enough to feel real. The 80s kid-friendly version of the same dread the bigger films trade in. By the way, if you are enjoying this so far, I put out videos like this all the time, and a subscribe would genuinely help the channel. Thanks. Tachyon Planet. Voyager parks in orbit for a few days, and an entire civilization below is born, builds rockets, and ends up worshipping the ship as a god in the sky. The Star Trek Voyager episode, Blink of an Eye, which aired in the year 2000 during Season 6, runs the concept in reverse. A planet's tachyon core creates a space-time differential so severe that time races on the surface while it crawls aboard Voyager. 1 second on the ship equals roughly a day down on the planet, which is spinning about 58 times a minute. Over the handful of days Voyager is trapped in orbit, the society below climbs from primitive antiquity all the way to a spacefaring power. Generation after generation builds its mythology, and eventually its entire space program, around the unmoving skyship hanging overhead. The mechanism is a fictional tachyon-driven dilation, rather than pure relativity, and the episode's own time conversions wander a bit from scene to scene, a known continuity quibble. But this is sci-fi television nailing the inverted case. The travelers hold still, while the world below sprints ahead, a full 14 years before Interstellar made the same idea famous. It is the rare instance where dilation builds a whole civilization instead of erasing one. 6-year crossing. Jake Sully sleeps through a journey that takes nearly 6 years, and relativity quietly shaves it down on the inside. James Cameron's Avatar, from 2009, sends its colonists from Earth to Pandora, in the Alpha Centauri system, aboard the ISV Venture Star. The crossing runs 5 years, 9 months, and 22 days in cryosleep, with the ship pushing relativistic velocity, around 70% of light speed. Because of velocity time dilation, the trip is genuinely shorter from the traveler's frame than from Earth's. Avatar buries this in world building rather than spotlighting it, but the relativistic crossing is baked into the franchise's physics, and it quietly sets up the generational stakes the sequels would later cash in. The Avalon. A starship crawls toward a new world for 120 years, and the screenwriter quietly admits relativity is bending the clocks the whole way. Passengers, directed by Morton Tildum and released in 2016, sends the starship Avalon, carrying 5,000 colonists and 258 crew in hibernation, toward a planet called Homestead 2. The journey is scheduled to take 120 years, with the ship holding at roughly half the speed of light for most of it. At that velocity, relativity means shipboard time runs measurably slower than time back on Earth. Screenwriter John Spates actually ran the dilation numbers, then found them too complex to dramatize beyond a single line of dialogue. So the gap stays small and only gets gestured at on screen. Jim Preston wakes 90 years early when an asteroid strike damages the ship, and the rest follows from there. What makes this one interesting is the restraint. The filmmakers did the relativity homework and then chose to keep the effect as a background truth rather than a plot device. It is a clean reminder that even a half-light speed crossing already invokes dilation. No black hole required. Mars Reconnaissance. 4 astronauts head home from Mars in 1957 and wake up, centuries later, in the year 2508. World Without End, released in 1956 and directed by Edward Burns, opens with a crew returning from the first crewed Mars reconnaissance flight that March. As the ship breaks Mars orbit, it is mysteriously accelerated to enormous velocity, and relativistic time dilation hurls the crew forward to a post-apocalyptic Earth in 2508. The director actually studied Einstein's relativity to justify that forward jump, which makes this 1950s B picture the ancestor of nearly every entry on this list. It dramatized relativistic dilation a full decade before Planet of the Apes used the exact same trick to land its twist. Tau Ceti. Ryland Grace races to save a dying sun, and the price of his speed is that Earth ages far faster than he does. Project Hail Mary, directed by Phil Lord and Christopher Miller, and released in 2026, adapts Andy Weir's 2021 novel and sends Grace, played by Ryan Gosling, to the Tau Ceti system, about 12 light-years out, to figure out why the sun is dimming. His ship reaches more than 90% of light speed, and at that velocity, the dilation is steep. The journey takes roughly 4 years from Grace's frame, while something closer to 12 to 14 years pass back on Earth. That gap is the velocity dilation doing its work. and the exact ratio carries over from the novel's physics, so treat it as approximate. The film opened in March of 2026 and became Amazon MGM's biggest debut to that point, pulling in about $141 million worldwide. As the most recent major depiction on this list, it drags hard relativity dilation back in front of a mass audience with a working starship at over 90% light speed, and the effect deepens the loneliness of what is already a one-way mission. The Time Cave. A group of students climbs into a cave and discovers that the world outside is racing by at thousands of times their speed. Time Trap, from 2017, and directed by Mark Dennis and Ben Foster, drops its explorers into a cave where time passes far slower for them than for the surface above. The signature moment comes when they realize the flashing light outside the entrance is the sun streaking across the sky, the unmistakable signal of extreme time dilation. The film frames it as an unexplained anomaly tied to the cave, staying deliberately vague about the exact mechanism, while surface civilizations rise and fall in what feels like hours to the people inside. This is the low-budget cult take, the one that drags dilation off the starship and into a cave, and it proves the concept can carry a grounded thriller without a single spaceship on screen. Pandoran Return. The reinforcements heading to Pandora face the same brutal trade Jake once did. Years on the inside, far more outside. Avatar, The Way of Water, directed by James Cameron and released in 2022, makes the franchise's relativistic travel far more explicit than the first film did. The interstellar crossings between Earth and Pandora again rely on ships running near light speed, and the franchise material puts numbers on it. An Earth-frame voyage of roughly 6.75 years, experienced as about 5 years aboard ship, at around 70% light speed. Those figures come from franchise canon rather than a hard line of on-screen dialogue, so hold them loosely. But the point is that the time gap becomes a stated cost of returning to Pandora. What was a world-building footnote in the first film turns into genuine emotional weight here. The knowledge that everyone you leave behind on Earth will have aged years more than you by the time you arrive. 3 Lost Years. The crew of the Dark Star has been burning through the galaxy for 20 Earth years, and barely any of them shows it. John Carpenter's Dark Star, released in 1974 and co-written with Alien screenwriter Dan O'Bannon, drops its audience into a decaying scout ship whose mission is to find and destroy unstable planets that might threaten future colonization. The dilation figure is stated plainly. 20 relativistic years have passed back home, but the 4 surviving crew members have aged only 3. Their commander died early on, preserved in a cryogenic chamber from which he can still hold a conversation, and the men left running the mission are bored, scruffy, and barely holding the ship together. The mechanism is velocity dilation, the same physics driving every other entry on this list, and Carpenter and O'Bannon get credit for being among the first filmmakers to treat it as background fact rather than dramatic revelation. There is no big speech about lost decades. The gap is simply there, in the instruments and in the crew's indifference to a universe that has moved on without them. Made as a student film at USC on a budget that started at $6,000 and grew to $60,000 after a distributor stepped in, it became the forerunner of the lived-in spacecraft aesthetic that Alien would make iconic 5 years later. If time dilation shows up everywhere else on this list as heartbreak or horror, Dark Star is the only version where it shows up as a punchline, and somehow that makes it sting more. The Dilation Weapon. A soldier crashes on a desert moon and spends years trapped there, while outside the moon barely minutes are ticking by, because someone weaponized time itself. Arrowhead, a 2015 Australian science fiction film directed by Jesse O'Brien and released internationally in 2016, follows Kai Cortland, a political prisoner who crash lands on a moon during a covert mission and slowly discovers its secret. The moon is the subject of a deliberate relativistic time dilation experiment, with 2 warring factions competing to weaponize it. The antagonist arrives on the surface, explaining that only 20 minutes have passed from his reference frame outside, while Cortland has experienced years stranded on it. The mechanism is gravitational and relativistic dilation, and the film uses it not as a plot twist, but as a weapon of war, the most cynical application of the concept on this list. Shot over 22 days in Coober Pedy, South Australia, on a budget of under $200,000, it is the most stripped-down entry here, a one-man survival film that earns its place not through spectacle, but through the logic of what it would actually mean if a military power could park soldiers in a time bubble and extract them seconds later, having aged years. It landed on Netflix in 2017, won O'Brien a science fiction writing award, and remains the most obscure film to have thought seriously about what dilation looks like when it stops being a side effect and becomes the point. If this was worth your time, consider subscribing so you catch every new video. Thanks for watching.